socially radical. Socially radical. Socially radical. Socially radical. Socially radical. Guitarist.
Promises are reckless. I'll still take my chances on us. Young and unprotected, vulnerably helpless in love. I feel at home, wrapped inside of your arms. It's cold here by myself. I've kept you far from the hurt in my heart. If you knew how I
Hello, everyone. Welcome to another episode of Socially Radical Guitarist. Song you heard just now was Meu Amor from Joyia. And before we go through another beautiful example of African women defending and upholding African culture and African traditions, we're going to go through the disclaimer. So anything I say or anything that my guests say on the show are the respective opinions of the host and the guest. They have nothing to do with Radio Waterloo, any of its subsidiaries, or any of its affiliates. So no, try as you might, you cannot sue public radio over this program. And yes, while the African and Caribbean Inclusion Center is sponsoring this show, the respective opinions of the host and the guest are solely the opinions of the host and the guest. So don't sue the nonprofit either. Support the nonprofit. Especially support their drive for full integration, full inclusion, and full equality. When Africans and Caribbeans come here in particular, and refugees in general, they should all be fully included, fully equal, and fully integrated. So please support that. And Socially Radical Web Design is a partner of Socially Radical Guitarist. So if you are in need of a website and are tight on cash, it is Socially Radical Web Design at a socially reasonable price. So just go to sociallyradicalwebdesign.com and make the request on the form right there. Also, both Socially Radical Guitarists and Socially Radical Web Design are partnered with Name Hero. And if you want web hosting, like if you have a website and if you are a web developer already and want web hosting at a reasonable rate, you can scroll down to the bottom of the page and click the white guy in the yellow cape. That'll send you to Name Hero, and you can get a discount when you go to the site through that link. Now let's go over this beautiful work. Rhythm and blues. It's called rhythm and blues because it draws its experience from blues, and it draws experience from jazz. And the great example of that is that little slide downward of the same chord at the end of this particular lick. I'll give you an example. So that slide downward it's a nice little trick that that R&B musicians will use to kind of add that soulful tone to what's going on. And like it draws its influence from jazz musicians not going the regular harmonic route of just using the different tones on the same scale, switching scales, switching the music, switching keys, and you'll find beautiful effects and creative effects being made from that. And it's an African tradition to do that, but it's also you'll find that jazz as a form of music has no race, and it's not tied to any particular race. There have been great contributions to the jazz genre from many musicians around the world, and the epicenter of jazz is the United States, um, which is a contradiction because the United States is a white supremacist state. But actually, that's also the reason why jazz was targeted. Why jazz ended up being in conflict with the ruling orthodoxy, with the ruling state. And when it got big in the 70s, also coincided to the mass consciousness surrounding the country, where the there were huge cracks in the anti-communist propaganda, partly because of the ability of alternative media was much stronger back then, because the control of media was decentralized. It was a decentralized form of media, and you'll end up with even prominent like directors, like I think George Lucas, the one that did Star Wars, being influenced by the truth of revolutionary socialist states like Vietnam, and seeing the imperialist attack on them, things like that. And the R&B scene in Toronto in particular has a lot of talent, as you can see. Great music being done by Joyia and Faye, the one we had on before. So many beautiful musicians doing great work, and yeah, they're not getting their due. R&B sort of fell off, and a lot of great music sort of fell off around the 2005 era, 2003 to 2005 era, after the control of the propagation of media was consolidated. And because we have an inherently patriarchal society, as seen by two old white men with sexual assault allegations in a row, being elected into the highest office in the United States, and two major parties, the conservatives, liberals, with a lot of sexual misconduct allegations on both sides, still being the two largest parties in Canada. A great example of that, and another example of that the gender pay gap and the malicious and fraudulent anti-LGBT attacks by, of course, the Nazbols, National Bolsheviks, and the far right in the United States, with great power and great control over the media. All of that coming together, and you can see that you'll find, because of these hierarchies and because of these systems which are really there to uphold capitalism, you end up with beautiful music like this being suppressed, even though there's a lot of great talent coming out of Toronto, and a lot of great music that people really should be aware of, but unfortunately aren't. So this ends up happening, and by contradiction, because it is a multinational state, um, the oppressed nations have to be rallied somehow in some way towards the settler colonial project and the imperialist project. And how does that get done? It gets done through liberal ideology. It gets done through liberal ideology. And the liberal ideology is essentially about taking what could be a legitimate avenue of struggle, the fight for multinational representation in positions of leadership within the society, twisting that into trying to co-opt and coerce multinational struggles or the struggle of oppressed nations into an avenue to legitimize the imperialist aims of the countries abroad. So, responsibility to protect doctrine, for example, which is really only enforced by NATO. The belief that democracy should be spread abroad, democracy, so to speak, as if a nation that oppresses other nations can be free in the first place, democratically in any sense. It isn't, but that's what's being said, anyways. And of course, a promise to give token gestures to alleviate the conditions of the oppressed nations. And making rationalizations and justifications and excuses for why not all of the promises, not all of the commitments that were made to the people will be implemented. So it all comes together. And what this show wants to do is to take what happens with music, why certain music is suppressed, why the propagation of proletarian culture is suppressed and mitigated, and why a white supremacist state will, in contradiction, use the fact that it's multinational, that there's a multinational proletariat, to make a moral so-called moral justification for its imperialist aims abroad. And that's something to understand, with NATO, what it's done, and with the arming of Yemen, for example, and what that's done. And incidentally, there was a movement, there was a protest at around 2 in Waterloo Town Square. I reckon that it was small, and it was dealing with the war in Yemen, where Canada and the United States are funding Saudi Arabia and giving Saudi weapons to brutalize the Yemeni people because um, they're because of the Houthis, and the Houthis, incidentally, are um, want independence. They have gotten support from Iran, which supports independence movements in the region, essentially. Largely is a defensive act because the regional problems will spill over if they don't do that. It is much like the same reason why many African states supported the ANC in Ukomto and Sizwe, in Konto and Sizwe, when they were having to flee South Africa and build a base of operations in other countries. So, a lot of things to think about. Um, but you see, there's almost no justification for that other than, oh well, it's Iran, evil, and it's an evil country. We're the country of good. Iran is an evil country. They don't have a right to defend themselves. It's too dangerous when they have nuclear weapons, for example. Things like that. Meanwhile, it's this country that has wiped out entire nations, entire generations, that is brutally suppressing culture. And you can make those connections. And, I'll talk about Russia and its system, its political system, and how we're really not in a position to criticize Russia, not only just because of the NATO encirclement, the condition that Russia finds itself in as a result of NATO, and because of looking at it from another point of view. If something like this had happened to the United States, where military armaments, weapons, and the potential for nuclear weapons being put on their border, what they would do, what they would react, how they would say anything. It's not just the hypocrisy of the whole thing, but also understanding that there are a lot of things that Russia does domestically that we could really learn from in terms of respecting the rights of nations. Because the rights of nations are not respected in this country. It's become a very clear and obvious fact. I mean, there was another protest at 2 online about mercury and contaminated water, poisoned water in the reserves. So a lot of things that we could learn from them, and that's a legacy of the Soviet Union. And it's a legacy of, that revolutionary country and that experiment in workers' control of the means of production. So I'll get into, the different aspects of Russian society and its system and its inner politics and what has actually ended up provoking this response, which is, from a factual standpoint, defensive. If you're being honest and looking at things from their point of view. But before that, we're going to listen to Melanie Faye and her beautiful song. It's a moot point. It's a moot point. And the great thing about this song is it takes what I just did in the first song and takes it to a whole new level. The beautiful comping, the beautiful phrasing, and using interesting and unique guitar tones. She's a very talented guitarist in that way. It was a shame I couldn't have her on as a guest, but one day maybe, when I finally beat the algorithm. If I can beat the algorithm, then maybe we can really get there. But we'll see. We'll see. So it's Melanie Faye, and it's a mood point. We're going to have that during the intermission, and then we'll be back for the political segment.
Now I'm falling through the cracks of an never-ending pavement, drenched in black, 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 as I hold on foolishly to the only thing that means everything to me. Don't cry, never wanna see tears in your eyes, babe. Maybe one more chance, babe, in your mind now. Don't cry, never wanna see tears in your eyes, babe. Give me one more chance, babe, in your mind now. Little old house, they said, but a never-ending darkness still remains my friend. And I know it's but a dream, because to you I'll never mean the much you mean to me. Don't cry, never wanna see tears in your eyes, babe. Give me one more chance, babe, in your mind now. Don't cry, never wanna see tears in your eyes, babe. Give me one more chance, babe, in your mind now. Still I'm falling through the cracks of a never-ending pavement, drenched in black, 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 as I hold on foolishly to the only thing that means everything to me. Don't cry, never wanna see tears in your eyes, babe. Give me one more chance, babe, in your mind now.
Hello, welcome back to Socially Radical Guitarist. Song you heard just now was It's a Moot Point from Melanie Faye and her eponymously named album Melanie Faye. It's an EP, 6 songs. Beautiful, every last one. Now let's get into the country that liberals want to demonize as Nazi for their own justifications, and it's the final last minute deflection to justify sending weapons to Ukraine. This incredibly nonsense political position that's taken by liberals, white liberals in particular, in this country. Let's go with first understanding the social character of Russia in the present. Currently, right now, today, the second largest party in Russia, the opposition in Russia, is the Communist Party. And the second thing we want to note is when the communists were in power, they were much more militant about dealing with NATO encirclement. In fact, this can be exemplified in 2013-14, when the Civil War was basically launched by Eastern Russia, basically saying they don't want to be part of the Nazi state. The communists immediately clamored for Russia to recognize the Donetsk People's Republic and the Luhansk People's Republic as independent states, to recognize them as independent states, and thus to give them, military protection, military aid. Another thing to note is simply them pushing for that is indication that if they were in power, they likely would have welcomed them into the Russian Federation. Just like Crimea was welcomed to the Russian Federation. Now, those are the politics. And Putin is a capitalist himself, yes. But because of that militant opposition on his wing, and because of the basic need to protect the national interests of the country, and because of, the compromise of nationalizing certain natural resources within the country, it becomes important for Putin to have a middle ground, and with ultimately the more militant anti-NATO stance that the communists would have had. So, arguing that what's happening now, this military intervention, is endemic of a fascist state, is nonsense. Especially when you know the history of NATO being led by Nazis. It flies in the face of that. There's no basis for it. It's nonsense. Add to the fact that Russia sees itself as a multinational state. In fact, Putin himself calls it a multinational state. And every province recognizes language rights. It's not a settler colony by any means, but it's multinational. And in contrast to the prison house of nations that was there before, Language rights are recognized throughout the country. Languages are given regional status depending on what part. And children are in fact taught in 3 different languages: English, Russian, and the language of the region. When they're done school, after grade 12, they then move on to regional universities with free tertiary education. So that's still there. That's still a legacy of the Soviet Union, what was there before. So, by any measure, just by what's happening domestically, this country is to the left of Canada and the United States. Especially when you consider the history here of how little children, when they were sent to school, had the language, their regional language, beaten out of them. Had the language beaten out of them. They were sexually assaulted into submission. And they were then killed off to be made an example of by government-funded Catholic schools. So, that's the truth. That legacy is there, and in this country, language rights aren't recognized. In fact, the lingua franca of many nations, the languages that they use to communicate each other across the continent, like across Canada, are not recognized as national languages. We have 2 colonial languages, English and French, and that's it. So, considering all of that, where is the basis to call Russia a fascist state? Ultimately, where is the military intervention happening? It's right on their border. And what direction has the NATO expansion gone before that? It's towards their border. From a practical standpoint, from an honest, legitimate standpoint, this is a factually defensive action. There's no way around that. It's defensive. So considering that this is defensive action, and considering the fact that multinational language rights are recognized, that higher education isn't just a privilege for the few or certain ethnic groups over other ethnic groups, and that historically the country has always been in solidarity with anti-colonial struggle, primarily communist struggle and national liberation struggles. Where is the basis to call this country a fascist state? The Putin, even this country right now, United Russia right now, supports socialist states, which is exactly why there isn't a single socialist state that was willing to condemn Russia for defending itself on its border. We can talk about how you want to feel about that, or how I would want to feel about that, but we're not in a position to be criticizing Russia for their reaction to something that this government is done. And ultimately, it's this government that's funding Nazis. It's Canada giving weapons to Nazis. It's Canada that's trampled on language rights domestically. Not Russia, Canada. It is Canada that has been trying to suppress the developing world and to undermine national liberation struggles. Russia isn't doing that. Canada's doing that. Russia's done the opposite. Russia's actually given the national liberation struggles a fighting chance, even today. In fact, they militarily intervened to stop the destruction of Syria. They provide weapons and military to support for countries in order to be able to assert their sovereignty. They engage in military cooperation and military exercises with socialist states. Today, that's happening today with this current Russia. So where's the basis to call this country a fascist imperialist state? Just based on its conduct abroad. Add to the fact that there's no economic basis to call it imperialist either. Because the key sectors where imperialism would happen, natural resource extraction and the export of finance capital, those banks going abroad are primarily state-owned. It's the government putting money into the BRICS Bank, for example. And that's largely for state-owned infrastructure projects. The money itself takes interest, and then that's it. And then if the loan isn't paid, the only thing that really happens is it's on lease to the country for a fixed amount of years until the loan's paid off. The infrastructure itself, like the fees, the toll fees or whatever. So that's not the export of finance capital according to the Leninist definition. Yes, it's capitalist. But the primary opposition in that country is communist. And that party has grown. And another factor to why this invasion by Russia occurred is that the Russian the Communist Party of the Russian Federation actually gained votes on a program of pledging to recognize the independence of the Donetsk People's Republic and the Luhansk People's Republic. So these are the facts. From a country that the working class is far higher educated in than ours. That they have a much better education system. It's just better. From a practical standpoint, the Russians, because of their social system, when it comes to education, are more educated and more capable of critical thinking than our country, than the people in our country. So, and they have proportional representation, and they have ranked choice voting. So where's the fascism? there's no basis. There's no basis to say it's fascist, no basis to say it's imperialist. And ultimately, the ones that are funding the Nazis is NATO. It's NATO. And Canada is aligned with NATO. It's part of NATO. So that's it. That is the truth, the honest truth of what's going on. We can clamor over like what they did in response, but we really have we're not in a position to be criticizing their domestic nature of the country, like their domestic policy or even the foreign policy, because ultimately the aggressor in this case, the one encircling the country, is NATO. So it's automatically a hypocritical stance. For those that genuinely want peace, for those that generally want an end to the war, they should not be giving the Ukrainians ground in negotiations to extend the bloodshed and extend the conflict. And that means no weapons should be going to them. They're Nazis. Incidentally, as of today, the Navy and the Air Force has been destroyed completely. I imagine that might have something to do with the fact that Russia's publicly stated that they will cut off any military aid going to the country, and that those supply lines are legitimate military targets in their view. That might have something to do with that, but I digress. It's been a month. All of the aspects of a country's military, in like a modern military, are gone. So it's no longer conventional. Azov Battalion, I believe, is gone, based on the reports I've been seeing. But and yeah, that's something to reflect on. That's something to look at. What would it mean to be in solidarity with working people? For the last 8 years, there was mass death, mass destruction. Where was the solidarity with the Russian-speaking people in eastern Ukraine during that? They were called the Russian separatists. They were actually given this sort of veneer, this echo of being evil, being sinister, by the media, in order to justify the bombings that had gone on for the last 8 years. And like that's deplorable, but it is what it is. That's what they've done. And we don't look inward. We need to look inward, but we don't do it. And that is something that I hope changes. And it's something that I hope people learn the history of, because Russia recognizing language rights, recognizing the right to tertiary education, recognizing essentially the right to housing. It's at 89-90%. And also giving space and room for communists to politically advocate for workers' control of the means of production should be something that we actually learn from. But for some reason, we don't learn. But we should learn. We should learn. And we should have some level of shame as the settler colonial satire comes to an end. And with that, we're going to have a beautiful song from a drama, a Chinese drama, Day and Night, by Yin Shuyi, and it's White Night. So we'll have the outro, we'll have that song, and that'll be it. We'll see you next week.
暗潮汹涌，此消彼长，春暖秋凉，别来无恙。明月当空，乘风破浪，谁心中有泪，挣扎于是非，爱假装不美，为爱赎罪。谁青春无悔，请勇敢一杯，逆风踏理想，一光三黑，开往白天的夜，有没有终点？星光凋谢，活在眉间，轰轰烈烈，代价不限。人海茫茫，无风起浪，暗潮汹涌，此消彼长，春暖秋凉，别来无恙。 明月当空，乘风破浪，谁心中有泪，挣扎于是非，还假装无畏，为爱赎罪，谁青春无